guests, forum via Facebook. Welcome to our live stream forum here in the ABC Studios, South Bank, Brisbane. At Women's Health Queensland. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet. Today, I'm the land of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. In all that we do, Women's Health Queensland likes to pay our respects and acknowledge the traditional cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal people. We particularly like to acknowledge the work that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women do in looking after the health and well-being of their communities. The subject of this evening's forum, media reporting of domestic and family violence, may be triggering for some participants. If you find there is something this evening that distresses you, I strongly encourage you to reach out for support. On the Women's Health Queensland Facebook page, you will find a list of support services that are there to help you. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you this evening's special guest, the Honourable Di Farmer, Minister for Child Safety, Youth and Women, and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence.
Thank you very much for having me. And look, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all joining in and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I just acknowledge the wonderful Kay McGrath and Bob Atkinson, who are the co-chairs of the Domestic Violence Prevention Council, and to actually all of the panellists who are here today and everybody joining in, and just say a really big congratulations to the women in media, in particular in Queensland, for the really proactive role that they take. In fact, women in media in Australia, I've had the great pleasure of taking part in a few events, and the real intent that the women in this state have to actually being part of the solution, to be part of tackling domestic violence, is so important. And I imagine in this panel tonight there's probably going to be discussion of the things that journalists can get wrong in reporting domestic violence. I'm sure there's a lot of examples. There are some great resources around produced by Our Watch and the Press Council, and lots of people have written about this. And I think I'm going to actually leave it to the panellists to actually talk about the things that are often identified in those guides about the sometimes really troubling ways in which media can portray domestic violence. And I want to talk instead about how absolutely critical the media is, what an absolutely important role the media has in actually doing something about domestic violence. And we always say that domestic violence is everybody's responsibility, and it's probably hard to know what that really means. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but actually knowing what you actually do about it. And we say that with the statistics the way they are with domestic violence, everybody actually knows somebody, and it's so important. The media has an opportunity to actually spread that knowledge and understanding, to spread that opportunity for every single person to be empowered to do something. They, more than anybody, more than any big corporate, any big organisation, has the ability to reach every single Queenslander and say, put your hand out, have that conversation. What is happening to you is not okay. And I really encourage people working in the media to challenge the myths and stereotypes about domestic violence, that we always think it's someone else who is living in some place else that's got nothing to do with us. And I think it's really important to actually tell the stories. Don't just tell the statistics. Don't just talk about what a terrible thing it is, because we actually all know that, but actually find the stories so people are confronted with the reality of domestic and family violence. And I think the murder of Hannah Clark and her babies was the most horrifically confronting story for so many people. And I think it deeply affected everybody for really quite some time. For people working in the sector, unfortunately, they hear those stories very often, the level of brutality and the level of evil and the level of intent. And I think it is really important to tell those stories, to confront people and actually challenge their responsibility. So that was my message for tonight. And it's too often, people are thinking, oh, it's got nothing to do with me, and why doesn't she leave him, and doesn't she realise? And they just don't. So it's an opportunity for media to really take us to another level and just exercise that enormous responsibility.
More, Minister. I think the media is absolutely our biggest ally in terms of actually preventing domestic and family violence, and a lot of that is telling those stories, but also really working at that primary prevention level and actually changing community attitudes and changing the way we view power and gender and all those things that we know feed in to and other causes of domestic and family violence. So thank you so much.
Oh, such a pleasure. I hope everyone has a great night.
We shall. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would now like to introduce this evening's moderator, respected journalist, newsreader and co-chair of the Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Council, Kay McGrath. Kay's face will be familiar to most of you for her long and distinguished news career. Having been a reporter, first on 10 Network or Channel Zero, and then from 1989 as prime-time news presenter on 7 News in Brisbane. While you see Kay deliver occasional stories on 7, a good deal of her time is now taken up as co-chair of the Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Council. That is why Women's Health Queensland thought Kay would be the best person to lead tonight's discussion. Kay will now explain the reasoning behind this forum and introduce each of our guests. I'll now hand over to the very, very wonderful Kay McGrath.
Thank you very much, Emma. And thank you also to the Minister. You may have heard her leave. She's a busy lady, and it was good to have Minister Di Farmer join us in the room. Just give me a minute to settle in here. Now, we are living in a brave new world, are we not? And of course, guess what? We're having a few technical difficulties, but we're going to soldier on. Of Our Watch, and the other from a very committed, passionate, eloquent survivor, Bianca. Now, sadly, the gremlins have conspired and we're not able to include that in our Facebook broadcast this evening, but I'm assured that they will be up on the Women's Health Network first thing on the website and Facebook page, I believe. Is that right? First thing in the morning, and they really are worth checking out, particularly, if I might say, the message from Bianca. So I'd really encourage all my colleagues in the media to do that. So thank you, Emma, for your warm welcome, and I, of course, would also like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered here at the ABC studios this evening and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I think it's so fitting that we begin with that word respect, because that's something that you would have heard from Our Watch CEO, Paddy Kinnersly. The word respect underpins this entire conversation. The conversation's getting louder and gaining more momentum. But it's about gender equality. This is what it comes down to, domestic and family violence. Let me just set the scene for you a little. Firstly, it's estimated to cost the Queensland economy approximately $3 billion a year to respond to the scourge of domestic and family violence. Some other statistics: at least 1 in 3 women in Australia has experienced physical violence by the age of 15. That's 1 in 3. 1 in 4 has experienced emotional abuse by a current or former partner since the age of 15. 1 in 5 has experienced sexual violence. Now, here's the thing. Only 1 in 10 of those attacks on women have been by strangers. So it's been by somebody that they know, that they're in a relationship with. And yes, domestic and family violence does happen to men as well, but there's no doubt about the fact that this is a gendered crime. And again, the underlying cause of that is gender inequality. Every week in this country, at least 1 woman a week is murdered by a current or former partner. We hear that statistic over and over. There's been an increase in domestic and family homicides compared to 20 during the 2018-19 financial year. There have been 25. This data from the Coroner's Office is current to the end of last month, May 2020. But that figure is likely to be revised up because some deaths are still being investigated. We've seen far too many high-profile and tragic deaths. Tara Brown, Chelsea Schilling, Teresa Bradford on the Gold Coast, and of course more recently as Hannah. Countless other lives have been lost over the years, many not receiving the courage or the prominence. Domestic and family violence is preventable. It is preventable, but only if we do our bit. And the media has a huge, huge part to play. Reiterating on what the Minister said, we play such a big part in changing the culture and the attitudes. We live in a huge state. It's a very diverse state, which is for a bigger challenge. But the media can and does help by giving victim survivors a voice, by helping to hold perpetrators accountable, and by reinforcing that community intolerance of the crime, because governments and agencies simply can't do it on their own. So we, the media, need to pay attention. We can't afford to look away. We need to acknowledge this problem also affects migrant women. It affects women with disability. It affects members of the LGBTIQ community as well. We have indeed come a long way since I began all those years ago in the newsroom, and we would listen to the police scanners and we would hear it was a domestic dispute and we wouldn't bother. So the question is, in 2020, how well are we doing? What are the challenges currently for media? How can we improve our reporting and keep the spotlight on this issue and keep the focus and the pressure on the lawmakers? Now, we have 6 invited guests, 3 from senior media roles, plus 3 leaders in the field of domestic and family violence services and prevention. Because these health directions are still in place and the somewhat clunky nature of technology, we are going to tackle it with one-on-one chats with our fabulous guests, and then we'll have a question and answer opportunity for you. So if you are following us along on Facebook, and I hope you stay with us, please feel free to send in your questions. We're due to wrap this conversation up at about 8:30. Also, our appropriately distanced guests. Now, I wonder if Tim can do a quick pan, because I just want to let you know who is actually in the room. We have Angela Lynch, CEO of Women's Legal Service, Holly Green from Network 10, former Police Commissioner Bob Atkinson, and my co-chair on the Prevention Council. And on the other side of the studio, we have the lovely Antonia Burke from Weali and Kylie Lang from the Associate Editor of the Courier-Mail. So welcome to all of our panellists who've made time in their very busy schedules to join us. And Cathie Schnitzerling, of course, from the ABC. So Cathie, I'd love to start with you. Let me tell you a little bit about Cathie. She was the first woman to be appointed Director of News for a commercial television network in Australia. That was 10 News. That was in Brisbane and later in Sydney. She's held senior editorial and leadership positions in television in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. She gets around, and is currently the executive producer of ABC's rural program Landline. She's also worked at a senior level in government media and communications. Cathie is the Queensland convener for Women in Media and holds a graduate certificate in leadership, coaching and mentoring from the Queensland University of Technology. She's one talented woman. You're a seasoned journalist like me.
Very seasoned.
Cathie Schnitzerling. Yes. You've seen a lot. You've got around. Let's begin this conversation by looking at some of the challenges that in 2020 face the ABC in radio and television reporting of domestic and family violence. What are some of the big challenges for you?
I think first up, Kay, and my colleagues would probably agree, we face all the usual challenges, which are accuracy, balance, contempt of court, defamation, privacy, consent and anonymity. But all of that becomes magnified when you're talking about domestic and family violence, because then you have to add in victim safety, attribution, corroboration, the Child Protection Act, the Family Court, suppression orders. You've got to balance public interest against reporting really gruesome details of some criminal acts. You still have to consider the right of reply, even for the perpetrator. Be very careful about the use of language, and that's something that we have seen change over the years. And also beware of falling into, it's almost like the unconscious trap of sympathy for the perpetrator. That whole look what you made me do type of thing. But I think one of the really big challenges for media, and not just the ABC, is dealing with the voyeurism trap, which goes with domestic violence. So just to explain what I mean, I've got some figures here which have been given to me by a colleague here at the ABC. So the ABC News Online in Queensland, their highest rating story ever was that of the murder of Hannah Clark and her children at Camp Hill. 1.8 million page views, 5 million engagement minutes. That was the number one story in Queensland ever on record for the ABC Online. The second highest, I'm really happy to say, it was about an old blue heeler dog that looked after a lost 3-year-old overnight, and they were both safe. So that's very nice. The third highest was about the 2 teenage autistic boys who were found in a very bad condition in a house when their father died.
So this you're calling voyeuristic, and of course all media agencies are driven by ratings.
But driven by ratings,
as we call it. So what do you make of that?
It is a trap, and that's the thing that I think we have to address, because I've got one more really good stat that I have to give you, and I think that it will go towards explaining, what the ABC is trying to do about how they report on this. Stream Media Monitoring, they have a constructive journalism roundtable, and they actually monitored the media during that time, and I think in just 1 week, the Camp Hill murders had 1,700 hours of consumption on all the major homepages of Australian media. That was compared with less than 100 hours of people reading stories about DV policy for 3 months. So that is this shocking crime, and we know that crime and big dramatic events will dominate media, whether they're commercial, mainstream or otherwise, and that's the challenge that we face, is how do we make those other stories, which are the stories that lead to the dramatic events, how do we get that out into the public consciousness?
And add the much needed context to these more high profile events.
Yeah, it all has to be within context, and it's so complex.
It is very complex. That's one thing that I've certainly learned. And it's been a privilege as a working journalist to have been invited to, first of all, chair the Implementation Council and now co-chair the Prevention Council with Bob Atkinson, because I can see both sides of the coin here. The ABC over the years, though, as you say, has changed its style and its approach. What changes have you seen come about, Cathie, and how did they come about, I guess?
Well, I think probably the most significant change that we've just seen, and it was just this month, the ABC has very strict editorial policies, and it issues guidance notes on how to deal with those policies. So there was one just released at the beginning of June, and it's about dealing with trauma and survivors of trauma. And even though it applies to, traumatic events, which may be terrorist events or natural disasters, it also is to be read in conjunction with an earlier guidance note from 2015, which is about how to report on domestic violence. So it takes all of that into account. With its fundamental aim, though, is to lessen the hurt, not exploit people, and try and aid in the healing of those people. So that's really significant, and that's just happened.
And I can tell you our pre-recorded comment from Bianca, a very brave survivor, who still has to maintain her anonymity, even though she managed to extract herself and her 3 children a number of years ago. Her plea to the media is show honesty and integrity, take care with our stories, because it can so often be a case of re-traumatising people who do find the courage and find their voice to speak up. Cathie, that's great. Overall, before I let you go, because I'm getting the wind up here, how would you rate Queensland media's coverage of this, as you say, very complex, very complicated, nuanced issue? How are we doing?
Look, I don't know whether in so many murders of women, but certainly at least now they're reported. We're going to them, whereas, as you said, we never went to them before. And the horror of Tara Brown's murder, the horror of Hannah Clark and her children's murder, at least now the question is being raised and looking behind that. Just before I do go, with the Hannah Clark and the Camp Hill murders, immediately after that happened, there was shock and horror. And there was a particular headline from Fox Sports that was ex-NRL player Rowan Baxter dies alongside his kids and estranged wife in fiery car tragedy. And I remember reading that and going, what? This sounds like it's her fault. And there was an outcry. There was so much pressure brought to bear on Fox that they changed that to say wife dies after her 3 children were killed by ex-rugby player when he set the car alight, basically. And I think that's the change.
It's been called out much more swiftly
yes.
and perhaps strongly. And those headlines are not being tolerated. And, of course, somebody's going to refer to Jane Gilmore's #FixIt, I'm sure.
Yes.
She does a fabulous job, I think.
Fabulous, and we should amplify that whenever we can.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Cathie, thank you. And thank you for your leadership in this space, and thank you for all the good work that you and Women in Media are doing.
Thank you, Kate.
No. Well, that was the fabulous Cathie Schnitzerling, who is going to take up her physically appropriately distanced chair while I introduce our next lovely guest. This is Antonia Burke. Antonia is a Yanyua Borroloola woman who grew up on the Tiwi Islands and Darwin in the Northern Territory. She's been the Wiali lead facilitator of national workshops and programs since 2017. And I literally bumped into this woman, can you imagine, in the back of Burketown it was, where she was with a group of beautiful young Indigenous women. And that's where Antonio told me that she had actually served as a member of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Advisory Group that came out of the Not Now, Not Ever recommendations. So it was wonderful to meet you there, Antonia. You've overseen the national delivery of Wiali's culturally informed trauma-integrated healing approach workshops with the 14 national family violence prevention legal services. You're doing some great work. With a graduate certificate in Indigenous trauma recovery practice from the University of Wollongong, Antonia provides specialised training to Sisters Inside Inc., which is, of course, a community organisation that advocates for the human rights of women and girls in prison, and runs Yangar, which is the Young Women's Healing and Empowerment Programs. Welcome, Antonia.
Thank you, Kay. It's lovely to be here with you again.
See you again.
Yeah.
Look, it's a particularly sensitive time right around the world on the issue of racism and equality. This evening's focus, of course, is on domestic and family violence, which in itself is a hugely complex and broad subject. In a country where Indigenous women are reportedly 3 times more likely to experience domestic and family violence than non-Indigenous women, I'm wondering, how do you rate the media in Queensland when it comes to covering violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women? And I believe you might have done a little bit of consultation on this question.
Yeah, I did. And thank you, Kay, for that wonderful introduction. I'd just like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people and all custodians across Queensland who are tuning in tonight. I just want to say that I'm here tonight because of Emeritus Professor Judy Atkinson of WeArLe. She was originally invited onto this panel, but because she lives in New South Wales and she had other commitments, she couldn't be here. So, hello, Auntie Judy. I know you're watching, and I hope I honour the space that you've created for me, and thank you for this opportunity. As Kay said, I am one of the lead facilitators of the WeArLe programs, which is based on over 30 years of global research by Professor Atkinson and her daughter, Dr. Caroline Atkinson, who are Bundjalung from northern New South Wales and Yiman from central West Queensland. Auntie Judy did her PhD in Queensland, which was published 18 years ago as a book, and it's called Trauma Trails, Recreating the Songlines, the Transgenerational Effects of Trauma in Indigenous Australia. Her research was done sitting with women and families living in rural and remote areas who were victims of violence. And her daughter, Dr. Caroline Atkinson, did her PhD sitting in male prisons all over Australia with the perpetrators of this violence. And what they both found was that both the victims and the perpetrators had the same or similar background stories of trauma leading up to the incident, which led to the perpetrator being incarcerated and the women and children being victimised. These are the people that police and journalists are responsible for reporting in the media. One ended up in prison and one didn't. Yet they both live with unhealed, complex, compounding, cumulative trauma and PTSD. The work that we do at WeArLe is designed to skill up the workforce to understand and respond to generational trauma in a respectful way. As you said, respect underpins this entire forum, and it's what we're all striving for when it comes to domestic and family violence. That maintains and restores dignity to people suffering from violence in this country, particularly the Indigenous community. We also provide guidance on healthy self-care practices to maintain a healthy mind and body, to reduce burnout within the industry, desensitisation, high rates of depression, alcoholism and violence in the home of the frontline workers such as media and police, such as yourselves, when dealing with vicarious and secondary trauma. We also focus on integrative community practices and responses to violence, to strengthen a community of practice, to get everybody working together. Over the past 2 years, over the past 2 weeks, I've contacted about 20 Indigenous people around the state and other areas and asked them the 3 questions that you, yourself and Trina have sent through to me. So the answers that I give you in the next 5 minutes are the collective voices of the Indigenous community in this state. And I just want to say thank you all for taking the time to answer my questions. I know it's a tough topic for us to talk to. So back to your question, Kay. How well does Queensland news media cover violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women? So the collective answer to this question was not at all, and never has. It hasn't improved. It's one-sided. It's victim-based reporting rather than focusing on the violence of the male perpetrators. And the blame is on Indigenous people, which fuels the stereotype that it's a cultural thing, which is untrue. Based on this feedback, I was prompted by a prominent Aboriginal leader in northwest Queensland, if you're watching, thank you, to look up the Australian Journalist Code of Ethics. These Code of Ethics state respect for truth and the public's right to information. Journalists search and disclose. They aim to remember. They inform citizens. They scrutinise power, but also exercise it and should be responsible and accountable. As journalists, you commit yourselves to honesty, fairness, independence, respect for the rights of others. The commitments that you agree to that are relevant to this forum are report and interpret honestly, striving for accuracy, fairness and disclosure of all essential facts. Do not suppress relevant available facts or give distorting emphasis.
So am I correct in saying those are the first two of 12?
They are.
Points
Yes.
in the journalist's code of ethics.
Yes, they
and they're
are.
very powerful.
They are. And they also comply with our cultural belief systems in all different Aboriginal cultures. So how can you comply with your own code of ethics as a journalist? And I'd like to pose that question to all of you. To report the violence in a particular place, you must do the research to find and tell the story, as the Minister said earlier, and as you also said, Cathie, that we must be able to find the voices and report them in a respectful way. What usually happens is an Aboriginal person or an Indigenous person who is committing violence is labelled as a violent person. Well, why are they violent? What happened to them? Rather than saying what's wrong with them, we have to shift our narrative around that. The children who are, because we aren't born violent, this is taught behaviour. The children who are witness to domestic violence are learning this behaviour. The boy learns to put his fists up and the girl learns to be submissive when living in a house where domestic violence is present. In the work that I do with Sisters Inside in Queensland, I do a lot of one-on-one work with women and young girls from the age of 12 years old who are either at risk of being criminalised, have been criminalised, or who have been released from prison. I do cultural healing sessions with them to try to end the violence. What I know before the woman or the girl turns up to sit in front of me, before I even meet her or know anything about her story, is that she will have a family connection to a certain community. Why do I know that? And these communities are the ones that are feeding into the youth and adult prisons. What I also know before she sits with me is that the Indigenous men in her extended family are also feeding into the same prisons as the perpetrators. How do I know this? Because I work like an investigative journalist. I do my research, I find out the history of the place, what happened there in the last 9 generations in that community or that town. Why are people from those communities filling up the prisons and perpetrating violence against their families? It feels like deja vu for me every day, Kay, because I hear the same stories coming out of the same places where the violence is ripe. But rather than labelling the people from these communities as violent, I consider them to be living with generational, complex, compounding, cumulative trauma, which was inflicted when they were removed from their families and their land and put into institutions of violence. Dominance and control by the white missionaries who ran the missions. That's where the violence started. And there are stories of white police officers and mission managers in these places sitting up on their horses, chasing young Aboriginal children who were on foot down to the creek to rape them and flog them, and instill fear in them so they don't tell anybody about it. Then the child becomes a man who uses alcohol and other drugs to suppress the pain, shame, grief and loss of power, and then releases this anger through violence when he is triggered by the violence that was inflicted on him as a child. Often when he is in a dissociated state, we know that the science is there. The girl then becomes the woman who has been conditioned to live with dominance, sexual violence, domestic abuse and promiscuity. And she will either fight, flight or freeze. If she fights and defends herself and her children, she'll end up in jail. If she freezes, she will end up dead or with chronic physical damage to her body. All of the evidence is there. Read Trauma Trails. Read Kylie Atkinson's PhD, which focuses on Aboriginal male violence and its relationship to generational post-traumatic stress disorder.
Antonia, it is such a complex difficult issue, and when you put it in context with a busy in these days staffed by younger reporters who perhaps haven't had that much experience, what advice? How do we shift the thinking so that the media, and particularly the younger members of the media who may be dispatched from the newsroom to go and cover an event, the pressure's on, they have to meet a deadline. What's your advice to those young reporters? What do? Stop and reflect on what?
Well, that's a big question, but I think that all goes back to who is that person and how were they conditioned to think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, women and children, and particularly the male perpetrators of the violence, before they even got into that room? How are these reporters and journalists being inducted into their profession? Are they taught to be culturally aware, to create cultural safety for themselves first and for everybody else? So are they trauma informed?
A great deal of upskilling and training could be done there. Antonia, sadly we're out of time, but one comment that I think will keep surfacing from tonight's discussion is about consulting experts and seeking comment or advice from the experts, from the advocates. Mm-hmm. You're one of them.
Thank you.
So I think there'll be an exchange. I know there'll be an exchange of phone numbers even in this room tonight. Mm-hmm. But is that the advice you'd give a young journalist? Make a quick call, a really quick, well-placed call to somebody can actually set the scene for more skillful and factual reporting. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that is. And I just want to end with one of the things that we talked about today earlier. Please. And I have to say this on behalf of all Indigenous people, that this violence is not about Indigenous culture. This is about unhealed trauma that has interrupted our cultural practices, and we are working to heal it every day, with or without your support. Do you want to create change in this country or continue the same narrative? And as Auntie Judy said to me before I came on air, the conversation is the protest. We circle into truth through story. Thank you very much for listening.
Auntie Judy would be very proud of you, Antonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for that. And I should add that Women's Health will provide some resources on the website as well, and a directory really for the media, so we do know where we can go for that insightful comment to add much needed context to our reporting. Our next guest has joined me, and it's the lovely Kylie Lang, very well-known journalist and a friend of mine. Kylie is the Associate Editor of the Courier-Mail and an award-winning journalist, opinion writer, columnist, TV and radio commentator and TEDx speaker who specialises in covering social issues. She's previously edited magazines for News Corp, including Q Weekend and Brisbane News, and worked on The Australian and The Daily Telegraph. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism, Japanese and English from the University of Queensland, completed an honours year in Japanese at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, and later completed a Master of Arts in Mass Communication from the University of Iowa. You must be exhausted, Kylie. Well done. It's lovely to have you here tonight.
It's wonderful to be here and with such a lovely group of influential people to try to make a difference.
Yeah, influential and all with the same goal in mind. It is indeed. It's a privilege. We heard from Cathie Schnitzerling from the ABC about the broadcast, some of the broadcast challenges. What are the main challenges facing those in the print media when covering crimes like domestic and family violence?
Well, there's a number of challenges, legally and ethically. I mean, legally, we cannot identify a victim, even if that victim wants to be identified, unless that person has been murdered. For example, if it's a stalking case and the person wants to be known, we can't identify. We can't identify children unless they've been killed. So there's certain legal requirements around what we can say and what we can't say.
And we've got Angela Lynch here from Women's Legal Services, and I've got a few questions about that for Angela, but sorry to interrupt. So carry on.
Part of the problem with that is then that we end up protecting the perpetrator because we can't identify that person either. So that's, some of the issues around the legalities. Ethically, we also can't report what we may want to say because we have a responsibility in what we actually put out there. Just because we know something doesn't mean we should always report it. I'll give you an example. In the case of Willow Dunn, the 4-year-old girl from Cannon Hill who was killed last month, two media outlets, the Australian and Daily Mail, who picked up the story, chose to say that her face was eaten by rats. So that information is out there. We at the Courier-Mail made a conscious decision not to reveal that information. It was widely available, but we found it was too gruesome, too gory, and didn't need to be said.
Who made that decision?
Kate Kiriakou, who was the crime reporter, she felt uncomfortable mentioning those details, so she went to our editor, Chris Jones. They had a discussion, she explained her reasoning, he agreed, and we didn't put it forward. So that was one example of sort of not censoring, but making a conscious decision of what's necessary for the public to know and how to also be sensitive for the victim. In the case of Hannah Clark and her 3 babies, obviously the most horrific case we've had in living memory, we at the Courier-Mail didn't talk about his great NRL career and how fantastic he was as an ex-footballer. We placed our focus on the victims, the mum and her 3 little babies. Our editor Chris Jones deliberately did not put the man's photograph or his name on the front page. We chose not to name him to give him that dignity, I suppose,
And I'm pleased to tell you that that was very warmly welcomed by Hannah Clark's family, who are very keen that he gets no recognition and therefore no notoriety. But this is something actually that I want to take up with Bob Atkinson a little bit later because there's an interesting angle there. Sorry, Kylie, I stopped you there with the coverage of.
Well, that's a number of the challenges, and then of course we've moved from basically a straight printed product to digital,
yes,
and that's where our growth market mostly is. And this is a difference in sort of report how you would position something for a digital audience to a print audience. So there's certain sensitivities around that, and we're still navigating that and negotiating that. So I think we have to be very careful with our reporting. I think we've come a long way, but we can always improve.
Tell me, this is a question from left field, are there any consequences for poor reporting? Are people taken aside?
Yes, certainly, absolutely, especially if something is inaccurate or insensitive. If something is written in such a way that is offensive, the journalist will be asked to change that. And I guess as we were saying before, some of the younger journalists, they do lack the experience, not only professionally, but life experience of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And they can be a little bit gung-ho to get the story out there and be first with the story. But let's check the facts, let's check the tone, let's check if it's appropriate, is it respectful.
Because the media often is caught up in that trap.
Yes.
Cathie Schnitzerling referred to traps. This is one. Everybody's racing to be first.
Correct.
And often accuracy is a casualty.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
That has happened.
How difficult is it to get stories in the paper about this topic of domestic and family violence? Because I know from my experience over the years, and we're going back a long way, let's face it.
Not that long.
Subjects like child abuse and domestic and family violence were regarded by news editors and others in the newsroom as being distasteful, unpalatable, and a turn-off for viewers.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. I would argue that things have changed. I think in the last 10 years in particular, and certainly in my career, which is also quite a number of years, I have really noticed a distinct shift in attitude and in our commitment to reporting issues. I think part of the problem is there are more crimes committed than we have journalists available to cover, but we certainly have really put that at the top of our agenda. Years ago, if a domestic violence issue, if we even reported it, it would be way down the back of the paper. Now it's getting that, it's on the front page of the agenda of our news every day. It's happening so often. I think we are reporting it more, not only because it's happening and people are reporting their own offence, the offences against them, but there's a genuine understanding amongst the public that this is not acceptable. I think, if we look in 2012 with Alison Baden-Clay, that was one of those turning points where it happened in a, leafy western suburbs of Brisbane to a prominent family. Nobody saw it coming. It shouldn't have mattered whether she was from a prominent family or from any family, but it was such a shock to the community because going back to what we were saying before, those stereotypes, probably couldn't happen here to these people. So, that really shocked the public conscious. I think also, Tara Brown, murdered by her ex-partner on the highway, bludgeoned to death while the Triple O listeners, were on the call. I mean, it's just horrendous. There's too many incidences to name, but I think we have really made a conscious effort to do our best. We can always improve, but I think really making it a community issue that everybody has to own is part of the solution as well.
Yeah, this is a really tough question, but what more could your organisation do to shine a light? And let's not forget the really vulnerable members of the community, the called community, migrant women, women with a disability, members of the LGBTIQ community who often and rightly feel invisible in this space.
Well, I think every organisation can do more. And I think we are part of a community that each of us has a role to play. For people who don't feel their voices being heard, there does need to be a lot more advocacy. There needs to be understanding from both sides, just exploring the issues and as we've said previously, why are these things happening? It's not just somebody becoming violent for the sake of it. There are ingrained issues in how children are raised. It's a societal problem. So yes, we certainly need to do better than we're doing. But I think we've come such a long way. And for me as a journalist, that is super encouraging because it means we're taking this seriously. It's not something that we are prepared to sweep under the carpet anymore. It's not just a domestic. And if I can give you one example, Kate Kyriakou, again, our crime reporter, she about 10 years ago was covering a horrific incidents of domestic violence in Adelaide. And a young man had broken into a family home, had a machete and stabbed 112 times a young 16-year-old girl and her parents, so killed the entire family. The reason was the girl had rejected his romantic advances. So the next day she went back and the family lived in a semi-detached home, so like a townhouse, so you'd have that adjoining wall. You would imagine the neighbour next door would have heard those horrific screams and how violent it all must have been. She asked him what had happened, what did he hear? And he actually said, oh yes, I heard people screaming, but I didn't report it to the police because I thought it was just a domestic. So again, it highlights, yes, the media has a role in reporting, but so too do members of the public in actually coming forward and telling us what's happening. And the other challenge for us in domestic violence cases is journalists don't have ready access to the courts. We can't just go and sit in on a case and find that story out. There are, generally speaking, they're closed courts. So it's about getting those stories told. We know they're out there. We want to tell them. We need people to come forward to us and share their stories. And once we can get some of those legal, I know why they're there, the legal constraints, but it does really mean that we can't tell as many stories as we would like to.
You write a lot of opinion pieces. You must do a lot of research. Do you consult, I would imagine, with advocates, with experts?
Yes, definitely. And I have a sort of a regular group of people that I can bounce ideas off, you being one of them. But again, there's always room to sort of meet new people with different viewpoints, and I was particularly interested in Antonia's comments earlier, so there's certainly room to grow.
I feel a column coming on.
Could be a column, could
Brilliant.
Be when I get home tonight.
Look forward to it. Kylie Lang, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you for all your leadership in this space because you have been particularly vocal. the Okay, it's now time to bring in the woman who's going to have all of our legal questions answered, Angela Lynch, AM, I might add. Angela is a lawyer and she's the Chief Executive Officer of the Women's Legal Service here in Queensland. Across her 25 years with the service, she's made significant frontline contributions to the prevention of domestic and sexual violence. She's also led and made important contributions to the development of law reform submissions at a state and at a national level. She's something to behold, I'm told, in the corridors of power. Her expertise has been recognised through her appointment to the Queensland Domestic and Family Violence Death Review and Advisory Board and as a member of the Queensland Sexual Violence Roundtable. Angela was awarded the 2017 Women's Agenda Leadership in the Legal Sector Award and the Lawyers Weekly 2017 Not-for-Profit Lawyer of the Year, as well as the Women in Law Excellence Award. She has an Order of Australia Medal, as I mentioned, for her services to prevent domestic violence. It's really good to see you, Angela. And your face will be familiar because I have never heard you turn down an offer to comment, and I have often suggested give Angela Lynch a call. I hope you don't mind my doing that.
No, I'm very happy about it, yeah.
For some insightful and professional and helpful comment to add context. From a legal perspective, and you've been listening intently, I know, to this conversation, what are your major concerns about the media coverage here in Queensland on this issue? Major concerns.
I think it's really fantastic, and I encourage everyone to listen to Bianca's story as a victim of violence, her interactions with the media, because I think she has some really wise words and some issues that she speaks about, which are at the forefront when we interact with the media, is around safety of our clients, and that's emotional and physical safety. So when the media is interacting with victims of violence, they have to really think about what are the repercussions of speaking out, because they can be very serious, including to their children. And they also have to think about what's the social, because of the social media and the commentary that can happen with media. So are they ready for that sort of social commentary that goes on as well? So it's about... But a lot of we do have victims that do feel that in their trauma journey that actually advocating for change is really important, and they want to engage. There's some real constraints. We spoke about legal constraints. Anything in relation to family law is Section 121 of the Family Law Act is one of the most restrictive publication suppression, sort of legislation in Australia around family law proceedings, around domestic violence order proceedings.
Do you think that's too tight, or there's good reason for that?
Look, it is difficult. The Australian Law Reform Commission actually looked at it in the end, and I probably agree with them. There is that issue of secret justice versus open and accountable justice. But I think that in those family law proceedings, it is so. To open it up would be quite dangerous and very dangerous for children. I think that and I agree with them, I think that they want to maintain the privacy aspects, but there are some things around the edges that could be done better. They have recommended a bit of a restructure around the edges to assist there. But in the end, I think that... I just think because of the impact on children, we can't open that up too much. And victims can speak out, and we have a lot of victims that do speak out, but they just have to do it with those, the covering of their faces and things of that nature.
And the correct support.
Absolutely. Correct support is...
there are a lot of steps that the media can take, and Bianca explains some more of this in her video, which And it's about staying in touch or explaining when the story will air or will go to print. And what perhaps they can expect from that.
Yeah, because the story for a journalist, this is a story, but for those women, this is their life. So it's just so important to be have that respectful engagement and obviously and just be respectful of what they are going through and that they want to know when it's going out and things of that nature. So I mean, it would be great, I think, if I suppose as community agencies, it would be great, you know, we always love funding, everyone loves funding, but to have some sort of, because we could get a group of women together if we had the funding to provide support to them to be able to access the media or to do that sort of media training and things like that's required for victims.
I can shed some light on that and share some news with you.
Oh, wonderful.
Women in Media Queensland, I'm very proud to say, has done some media training with a group of survivors from the Brisbane Domestic and Family Violence Service,
fantastic.
Voices for Change, and we had them at Channel 7, which makes me very proud, and helped them, along with Media Potential, who I should give a plug, helped them craft their stories. And I suppose this is a journalistic term, but to sell their story, make sure that they pitch it.
Well, you do think in a different way. Like everyone thinks in a different way. A lawyer thinks in a different way. A journalist thinks in a different way. So they're thinking about what is going to get, you know, the most clicks and the whatever. So
and this comes back to Minister Di Farmer's point, is about the media helping shift the culture and the attitudes by storytelling. Because that is so powerful, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think the media in Queensland understand the issue of DV sufficiently?
Oh, look, everyone can do that. I mean, I think that, they really agree with Kylie. I think that the media has come an enormous way. And you're trying to sort of pinpoint what was it that has happened. I think sometimes I also think that statistic of one woman a week dying and then pulling together that it was that Counting Dead Women project that pulled that statistic together. And I think it was then that people started to go, what, one woman a week is killed from domestic, and there was just these were just disparate stories that happened across the country that were never pulled together, and that actually pulling that together, that statistic, and obviously there was an enormous amount of work and advocacy and everything else that goes along with that, but I do think that statistic really has made a difference in people's minds, because for the average person in the street, that's an enormously powerful statistic. That is something that we can't turn away from, and that everyone goes, well, we must do something about this. We have to change. Yeah.
Just very briefly and finally, Angela, perhaps for those watching tonight and going and watching it in the future, just give us a very brief overview of what Women's Legal Service does here in Queensland.
So we provide free legal advice and help and assistance. It's statewide through our 1-800 number. We do representation, obviously, in some court matters. So we work in domestic violence, family law, some child protection matters and some sexual violence matters. We do a lot of community education around the law and obviously violence against women, and we do a lot of law reform work, so seeking to bring about systems and legal change for the betterment obviously of the women that we serve and broadly for women in Queensland.
Any last sage advice for journalists watching to how they could better report on this with your legal eagle hat on?
Oh, look, well, we wouldn't have Jane Gilmore if there wasn't an issue, would there? So I think it's those issues that Jane constantly is bringing up in the media.
And for those who aren't familiar with Jane, it's #FixIt. And can you think of some of her examples? Well, she just puts a red pen through inappropriate.
Well, there was in that headlines. It was a terrible murder of Ruth Matuffa it was only about 3 weeks ago when she was stabbed in Sydney and killed by her former partner. I think that the headline was "Man and woman, both 22, die in tragic double stabbing." rather than he had killed her. And there was some sort of insinuation she'd gone there because they'd just separated. So it's just that kind of insinuation that the victim somehow had brought this on, whilst she, in fact, he had murdered her and killed himself. So these sort of things, that was only a couple of weeks ago. So these things do still happen, of course. Yeah. But look, I mean, overall, I think that the media has done quite, they have really moved mountains in many ways from, only a decade ago. And there is an interest level in the community. And I think that women and, people in the community want change, and the media is both a driver of that and reflects back also that community opinion that we have to bring about change. But of course, we have a long way to go, and certainly the communities that Antonia has spoken about, and those other communities, we still have a long way to go in relation to understanding that complexity. Yeah,
but we're all in it together.
Yeah, we
Hopefully.
are.
Yeah. All heading in the same direction. Angela Lynch, thank you so much.
Thank you
for bringing your wisdom to the panel. It's very much appreciated, and all the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next guest is Executive Director of my opposition, Network 10, and it's the lovely Holly Green. A Townsville girl, she began her career in radio before making the jump to TV with Channel 10 more than 2 decades ago. She began as a court and a police reporter, much like myself, Holly, before heading behind the scenes as a producer in the mid-2000s. Holly has worked on some of the nation's biggest news events, including the East Timor military campaign, Melbourne's Gangland War, and the Black Saturday bushfire disaster. Since October 2016, Holly's been at the helm of 10 News First, Queensland, and during that time has worked very hard to help shine a light on domestic and family violence and ensure that victims and advocates are given that voice that we've been speaking about. She's a very passionate supporter of the work being done by charities, including the Darkness to Daylight campaign and the Alison Baden Clay Foundation. Thank you for all that good work, Holly, and thank you for making the time to be part of this broadcast.
Thank you for having me, Kay.
We haven't really touched on the workplace yet, and my friend and colleague, Bob Atkinson, told me this today, that 60% of those affected by domestic and family violence are indeed in the workforce. And of course, journalists are not immune. Nobody's immune from domestic and family violence. Tell me, what sort of policy does the 10 Network have in place when it comes to DV?
You're right. The statistics alone tell us that not only do we work alongside victims of domestic and family violence, we also work alongside perpetrators of domestic and family violence. And I'm really proud that I work for a network that has put in place such an extensive domestic violence policy, and it is impressive. It's a shame that it has to be that impressive.
What do they offer?
So we offer 10 days of paid leave, domestic violence leave. There is the option to extend that leave if needed at the discretion of management, and from my dealings with Network 10, it's always delivered. There is security that is offered, there is accommodation that is paid for, there is upgraded technology in case devices have been, intercepted by, perpetrators. There is a range of measures. There are counselling services that are available, not only to the victim of the domestic and family violence, as in the employee, but also their family members, their children. And it's ongoing, that support. And it's something as simple as applying for that leave. There are also measures that are put in place to protect somebody's privacy, so they wouldn't go online like you would put in annual leave or sick leave. There are other measures for them to be able to maintain that privacy. Anyone that is in a position of authority, management, no matter what level they're at, have undergone domestic violence training, so they know what to look out for. They know signs, warning signals that could be there, how to approach that, what questions need to be asked, how you deal with that. It's extensive, and as I said, it's impressive.
That is impressive, and bouquets to Network 10 for that. Holly, you touched on counselling. The topic of vicarious trauma. Have you encountered that in your role as a manager? And what supports? You've mentioned counselling, but have you seen this? And how have you managed it?
Yeah, look, and I think we've talked a lot tonight about Hannah Clark and her children, and I think, that is in large part to the prominence that the case and Hannah's story has had, and how much of a turning point it is. But particularly with that story, it was a story and continues to be a story that impacts our newsroom constantly. I have a very stoic newsreader who broke down in tears on air that night. Rarely done. I had journalists, camera operators, editors, seasoned people with decades under their belt that have seen horrific things, so terribly moved. And we made a very quick decision to be proactive and not reactive. Made a decision to make sure that a counsellor was brought on station on the Friday night, and I made it mandatory that everybody attended. And if people felt like that they didn't need it, my response to them was, well, your colleagues do, so you be there for your colleagues, and it's the least that you can do in taking on board what people are dealing with when they tell these horrific stories. And I think by acknowledging their feelings and vindicating their feelings, you get better storytellers out of it as a result, and there's a compassion side of things. If you recognise one person's compassion, i.e. a journalist's compassion, they're more likely to write their stories in the future compassionately as well. Correct. So,
and I'm pleased, I can tell you Seven also had counsellors, a counsellor there, and I would be surprised if the other news outlets weren't also doing that. Negative feedback. Do you encounter much negative feedback from coverage of stories like Hannah Clark or other DV stories?
I think it's a divisive subject, and when you post stories online, particularly the Facebooks of the world, where there's rolling comments coming through that you can't really moderate too easily without constantly being on it. It's difficult, and we do receive a lot of feedback. It's gender driven. It's 9 times out of 10 males turning the tables and saying, well, if this was a male, they wouldn't get this kind of coverage, and this perceived inequality that is happening. So being on top of those comments is a full-time job in itself, because you want to make sure that they don't linger in the atmosphere for too long. You want to pull them back. You want to be on top of them straight away, and you don't want your platform to be the platform that drives that kind of debate. You want your platform to be a positive platform for change and good outcomes, and not the sort of place where people are going to jump online and start, casting their opinions and comparing apples with oranges, because it's not the forum to do it. So, yes, we do get inundated with negative feedback, negative comments, and a lot of it gender-driven.
So are you ever tempted maybe to pull back on a DV story, because it is a bit torrid, it is a bit heavy, and you're going to get pushback?
No. I think if a story has gone to air, then I've already done all of that work. I've already done that assessment.
But have you ever thought, no, we're not covering DV 3 nights in a row because it's too much for the viewers?
No. Do
you think, this is one from left field, you'll hate me for this, you're a female news editor, does that make a difference?
No.
Shouldn't?
No, I don't think it does. I think the people that get into our industry and stay in our industry are storytellers. They want to tell people stories, and sometimes those stories are uncomfortable stories, but they're still stories that deserve to be told. And if you make a commitment to tell a story, then you're making a commitment to tell it right, and to see it through. And it doesn't matter if it's the 3rd day running, if it's the 4th day running. If that story has still got something to be said and something to be told, then you stay with it.
It deserves to.
Yeah, and I think that's why our debate around domestic violence continues, because there's so much still to be done. And I couldn't agree more with other panellists. We have come a really long way, even from when I first started. But we have so much further to go. And I think it's these kind of sessions, talking about it, pinpointing stuff like what Antonia had, outlaid. We can only learn from that stuff, and by hearing it and taking it on board, then you get to improve.
How difficult is it to upskill journalists in a fiercely frantic environment where jobs are being lost, people are being stretched, resources are thin, and we want them to be upskilled on this very serious issue? That must be a huge challenge.
It's difficult, but I think that's where you look to your mentors within your newsroom, your senior
leaders.
producers,
Yep.
And making sure that, that sort of advice. And I'm really lucky because I've got a really strong team of great senior producers who are across all of the issues that they need to be, not just on domestic violence, but on a range of things. And, I've got some young journos that have come through, and it's very easy to teach young journos if they want to listen, and I think that is one of the changing of the generations that we have. They want to learn. They want to be able to do it better, and I think as long as you have young journos that want to do it better, you'll be able to achieve that.
I'm all for having a champion in the newsroom. I think that's vital, and if you've got some really enlightened senior producers on that desk, they're really setting a tone. Yeah,
we don't always get it right. And I think sometimes that's okay. We're never always going to get it right, as long as we know that we can always do better. Yeah.
Brilliant. Holly, congratulations on that, and great to see that workplace policy firmly in place there for Network 10 employees. Thank you so much for joining us. It's time to bring in our last panellist, and then we're going to have time for questions. And I think we're running on time. Our final guest for this evening is Bob Atkinson, AO, APM. After a long and distinguished career in the police service, 12 of those years as police commissioner, Bob then served on the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child abuse, and he served that role for 5 years. More recently, Bob chaired Queensland's Youth Justice Review, which led to the 2018 release of this state's Youth Justice Strategy. He's currently chair of Queensland's Truth, Healing and Reconciliation Task Force. He holds a graduate certificate in police management from Charles Sturt University, and he's a man who can't say no. I was delighted when he agreed to co-chair the Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Council with me. Welcome, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Kay.
Have you enjoyed the conversation so far?
It's been great. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, I think.
Yes.
Do you mind if I go back to your time in the police service? Because often early information around domestic and family violence comes, of course, from the front line, from police officers, either from an officer on the scene or the police media unit. And the officer's description can set a tone, can set a scene. With all your years' experience being on the beat and then further up the ranks, of course, what are some of the potential stumbling blocks in that first interaction for both police officers and journalists, I guess? What are the stumbling blocks? Okay,
thanks. And thanks for that opportunity to comment too, because it is a very long time, but I joined the police department in 1968 and I really endorse the comments of the journalists this evening that said we've come a long way, because I think we really have.
You would have seen a lot in that time.
Well, there was no legislation at all, and the police views were probably consistent with societal views that domestic violence was entirely a private matter, in many other wrong views as well. And in fact, the legislation didn't come into place until 1989. So
that's extraordinary when you think about it in those terms, isn't it?
I think it is, yeah. But thank goodness that it eventually did. But in a more contemporary sense, and of course it's important for me always to say that I don't speak for the police department. It's been nearly 8 years since I concluded my career, which I was very grateful for. But I think probably some things haven't changed. I think obviously it's necessary, absolutely necessary because of the privacy, but the legislation is clearly an issue in terms of what the police can say and of course what the media can report. I think as well too it's probably true that investigators and police tend to be really cautious, so would want to be sure that anything they did say was completely accurate, whereas my sense of the media is there's an urgency about getting information out to the public. And as well, for the investigators, they wouldn't want to compromise the investigation. That can happen at times too. If there's a suspect and they think they might know where the suspect is, and to go too public might compromise that investigation. But having said that, I think I have a very positive feeling about the media. I do think, again, we've come a long way. I think things, for example, like the Amber Alert system are just fabulous. They really are. But I think that the real difficulty is we have got so much further to go with this, and the media and the police and the community and government working together can be and is an incredibly powerful thing. I know from some of my own personal experience, two matters, if I could just mention briefly, the Sean Kingy murder at Noosa in 1987. And
you were the lead investigator on that?
I was stationed there at the time. And I don't think that would have been solved without the media. The media covered that in the print and television and radio every day and gave it lead story coverage, and that eventually created so much pressure for the people responsible that they fled the state with a view to, for things to cooling off. And that action on their part led to their apprehension in New South Wales. The Daniel Morecambe case, which you were, of course, totally familiar with, and that was different in the sense that was sustained over many, many, many years, the interest. And again, I think if that had not happened, then ultimately that investigation would have been far more difficult than it was, and may not have got the result that it did. And
that reminds me, sorry to cut in, Bob, just to follow up on a point that I wanted to get from you earlier. We know that the Clark family, for instance, don't want the perpetrator's name used.
No.
And we get that, don't we?
Yes.
However, you've got a bit of a different insight into that. Would you mind sharing that?
Well, it's such a difficult area. Absolutely respect the position of the Clark family. But I do think that one of the risks in this and one of the wrong attitudes is that people might be driven to this somehow, or that something must have happened to cause them to snap. That's not my view. And it is nearly always men who commit domestic violence. They make a conscious decision to do what they do. There is no excuse or justification for that behaviour. So I think we need to call that out as well.
But sometimes it's helpful for investigators to get that name out, the name of the offender out.
Of course, yeah. There could be many reasons for that, many reasons. It could be that people might be able to provide information in terms of the investigation. It could be that somewhere there are other victims who've never been prepared to come forward. So, yes, it's never a simple solution, or there's never a simple answer, is there, to anything in this space, I think. But I think that the role of the media is just fundamentally paramount. It's essential because this is about changing community attitudes and values, changing behaviour. And without the media, that's not going to happen. And it's particularly difficult, I think, with the road toll, wonderful example of the media and the community working together. But this is harder, I think, because what we're about here is changing that community attitude that says, oh, this is a private matter and it's not something that I or we as a community should get involved with. And that's going to be hard to change. But I agree that we're on the way, but we need to maintain the momentum.
And you really have answered my last question there, Bob, as co-chair of the current Prevention Council. This is why you would encourage the media, those journalists who are tuning in, to continue shining a light, to continue covering it as best they can, providing as much context to the stories. To bring about that cultural and attitudinal change.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. This is a really major issue for the Australian community. The statistics are horrendous, and I think in the past they've probably been hidden a bit again because of that aspect. Well, really, it's a private matter between two people in their own home.
And as we've heard, it affects every one of us. It could be your daughter, your sister, your mother, your niece.
Far too many, and it's right, and I guess it's necessarily that we focus on the terrible things, the murders, but every day in Australia 10 women are admitted to hospital through domestic and family violence. Now, if that was through shark attacks or mining accidents or something like that, there'd probably be some sort of outcry. But the statistics are horrendous, so we all have to keep at this.
And the media has such an influential voice. Bob, it's a joy to work with you on this Prevention Council. I'll get you to stay there for a minute because the time has come to, let's see if we do have some questions from our Facebook followers. And indeed we do. And Bob, here's one for you while you're in the hot seat. And I'm not sure who this has come from, but the question is, who guides and advises the police and media on language in reporting? Example, why do we keep hearing the backstory about being a good guy or a great dad? I'm not sure that the police would necessarily describe a perpetrator as a good guy or a great dad. Perhaps that's not so much for you to field that one. What's your take on that, though?
I think that comes back to trying to find some excuse for behaviour, and I don't think that's right. And as has been said quite often, there is no postcode with this, and it's conscious behaviour, and it may well be the perpetrator has not offended in other ways. It may well be that that person is popular within their own social group, and that what happens in their own home is secretive. But again, I just don't think that that is in any way a justification or rationalisation or excuse.
Absolutely. And I might get Tim to fling across to Holly because Holly may have a comment. My take on that one, Holly, would be that reporters are under the pump. They need to get some comment. They've got a deadline to meet, so they've probably done a door knock.
I think also it goes to some extent what Kylie said, you want to give as much information as you can. But at the same time, I think, and I know we revert back to it, but with the Hannah Clark story particularly, I think that there's this degree of the enormity of the tragedy. You're trying to reconcile with yourself about how you. He was a loving father. We know he wasn't a loving father because of what happened. But you're giving this, a complete picture, the best that you can, with what you've got at the time. And, we're in a news cycle that moves very quickly. With that particular case itself, it wasn't put out there straight away that we're calling her Hannah Clark. Something as simple as that. She wasn't referred to as Hannah Clark in the very start of that story. She was referred by her married name. And even being able to get that message out there very quickly, proved difficult. So, you're working with a lot of external factors. You're working under the pump. You're trying to get the best story that you possibly can out in a situation that is moving.
And if I can put this question to you from one of our followers, do you think awareness of DV has increased during COVID-19 because of increased cases? And if judges are seeing more cases, will they be educated on types of abuse?
Oh, goodness. I don't think that through COVID-19 haven't necessarily made their way before a court yet. Although the Family Law Court did act quickly to set up a list to respond to disputes concerning parenting that related to COVID-19. Look, we have got a long way to go if we're talking about understanding of domestic violence in relation to the legal system. And that includes judges as well, of our understanding of what encapsulates domestic violence, and those there is still a focus in the legal system, unfortunately, on physical abuse and not so much on those other elements of abuse, which are the coercive and controlling elements, the emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and these elements and the high level of control. And it's actually these elements that can be the most dangerous for women and children leaving domestic violence. Those non-physical elements can be the most dangerous, but in fact, it's perhaps the least focus that is given in the legal process. So in relation to another field where there's a whole lot of education needs to go into issues of domestic violence is obviously the legal system as well. Yep.
Thank you, Angela Lynch from Women's Legal Service. And one last question, and I think we might end up where we started. This is a question for Cathie Schnitzerling from the ABC. Cathie, this our viewer wants to know, how does the media address and challenge gender stereotypes that influence and, in a way, normalise DFV? Now, did I hear you say at some stage that there is some training coming? Training.
Yeah, look, the ABC already has its 50-50 project, which it started in December 2019, and that's going towards 50% representation of women in our stories, not just men, because we did a count and found that mostly women were mentioned in our stories when they were victims of crime. So how do we change that? So we look to find female commentators as well as male commentators in stories, and also to tell stories from a woman's perspective or that encapsulates their experience. So that's happening, but in the very near future we're working on another project as well, which is in relation to domestic violence, where we'll be working with domestic support agencies who will come in. There'll be training offered for journalists across all levels, not just junior journalists, all levels, and also so that we can identify, we've got a number of reporters in different states who are doing domestic abuse stories, but they're working in isolation, and how to bring them together so that we can tackle specific issues that will help break down those stereotypes and raise issues rather than just being caught in that dramatic news cycle.
And response.
Yes.
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 Excellent. That's so encouraging to hear. Congratulations to you. And we are out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Emma. But in closing, I would just like to again reiterate, and these words are going to come out of the CEO of Our Watch, Paddy Kinnersly's mouth. The nature of our reporting is absolutely vital. The more accurate reporting, the more change will come about and lead to greater respect, which is where we began. And it's all about gender equality. Can I congratulate you, Emma, and Women's Health Queensland on this initiative? Thank you so much for making it happen.
Thank you so much, Kay, for coming along and being such a wonderful moderator for us this evening. There's been some great discussion this evening, and I certainly have some great takeaways from everything that everyone has had to say tonight. I think some really important things for us to walk away is, firstly, how important the media is in terms of changing the narrative, changing the story, and reporting really accurately and appropriately in instances of domestic and family violence. I hope everyone has been prompted to think more deeply and widely around the way that domestic and family violence is reported. Really importantly, I think that these conversations shouldn't stop here. I hope everybody who's watching online and everyone who's participated today goes and puts something positive into practice tomorrow in their workplaces or in their communities, and keeps on doing so, because I think we really do need a united effort to change the story around domestic and family violence. And I really want to thank the media for their participation this evening and for all the great work that they do moving forward. I think there's certainly an opportunity for the media to do some training around the way that they report on domestic and family violence. There's the opportunity to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around interacting with their communities in positive ways. And certainly for the sector and the women and domestic violence sector, there's some great opportunities to get a greater understanding of the way in which the media works. And Women's Health Queensland certainly hopes that we can achieve all those outcomes if we work together. Before we close, I need to say some very big thank yous. Firstly, to the ABC for giving us this wonderful auditorium this evening. The ABC has been a long-time supporter of our sector, and we are very, very thankful for their ongoing support. Our thanks go to the Honourable Di Farmer, Minister for Child Safety, Youth and Women, and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence. It's a very challenging and diverse portfolio, and her efforts and contribution are greatly appreciated. We have some very, very special gifts of appreciation for our wonderful moderator, Kay McGrath, and for each of our guests, Cathie Schnitzerling, Antonia Burke, Kylie Lang, Angela Lynch, Holly Green and Bob Atkinson. Finally, I mustn't forget to express my sincere thanks to the ABC Tech Whizzes, Tim Christie and Peter Scott, and a big thank you to Les Johnson, who's been immeasurable from the ABC. I would also very much like to thank my Women's Health Queensland colleagues, Trina and Mel, Molly, Morgana and Alice. You've all been amazing and you've put this evening together, so thank you so much. Most of all, thank you to everyone who has joined us on Facebook this evening, and for those who are replaying the event from our website later on. I invite everyone to keep up with what's happening at Women's Health Queensland. We do have some amazing things coming up. You can check out our website, womenshealth.org.au, and we have posted a list of useful contacts around domestic and family violence that are specific for media personnel. So if you are in the media and you would like to get in contact with someone for a particular comment, we have the list of everyone who is here this evening, and also some other resources that you'll find particularly helpful. Good evening, and let's all work together to end domestic and family violence. Thanks so much.